I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about a recent phone call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky. And the phone call didn't go over too well. What's going on here?
I mean, it's an extraordinary telephone call. We have the Kremlin's transcript, and I have to say, from the Russian side, one of the most brutal transcripts of a telephone call I've ever read. What's been happening is that over the last couple of weeks, since there was the appearance of some movement between Ukraine and Russia, there was supposed to be a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. That hasn't happened. And the Russians feel that they made certain moves towards Zelensky by agreeing a swap of prisoners. And they were expecting, I think, some further movements. And then there was a summit meeting a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Normandy 4 meeting, which Merkel and Macron also attended. And nothing seemed to come out of that. And then there were hopes or expectations that there would be some movement afterwards. And nothing happened. And instead, we had some Ukrainian officials suggesting that Ukraine might be considering pulling out of the Minsk Agreement. The Minsk Agreement was this deal that was done between Putin, Poroshenko, Merkel, and Francois Hollande in Minsk in February 2015. There was a big battle at a place called Debaltseve in eastern Ukraine, where the Ukrainian army was comprehensively defeated and, in fact, surrounded. And the deal that was done, as part of the deal to get those troops out of Debaltseve, was that there would be a roadmap towards a peace agreement, towards peace, which would involve Ukraine granting extensive autonomy to the regions of eastern Ukraine, to the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, incorporating the agreements to grant this extensive autonomy in its constitution. And then at the end of that process, the Russians would agree, once all that had been settled, to allow Ukrainian border guards to return to patrol that part of the Ukrainian-Russian border, which adjoins these two rebel regions in the eastern Ukraine. And again, the Minsk Agreement made it perfectly clear to anybody who reads it that it was envisaged that there would be negotiations between the Ukrainian government and the rebels in eastern Ukraine to come to these sort of agreements to settle what these constitutional and autonomy arrangements would be. None of that has happened. None of it happened under Poroshenko. And there were some expectations by the Russians that it might start to happen under Zelensky. It hasn't happened. And some of Zelensky's officials are now hinting that Ukraine is intending to pull out of the Minsk Agreement. So in this telephone conversation between Putin and Zelensky, Putin directly asked in the most frank language, and I mean, the Kremlin transcript actually says, frankly, he asked Zelensky to be frank, does Ukraine still abide by the Minsk agreements? And does Ukraine still intend to have a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine? So in effect, what Putin was challenging Zelensky to admit to is that Zelensky is no longer negotiating on behalf of Ukraine in good faith. Now, that suggests to me that the Russians have lost all hope of any kind of agreement with Zelensky at all, and that Zelensky's credit in Moscow is now completely exhausted. So all the moves that we saw after Zelensky won his election victory have come to absolutely nothing. And where Russia-Ukraine is concerned, we are back to square one. In other words, to a continuing frozen conflict.
Why does Zelensky not want to follow the Minsk Agreement? I mean, obviously, Zelensky's going to get his marching orders from the United States. That's obvious. What forces in the U.S. then are giving him these marching orders, and why is he doing it?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the answer is this. He's got two pressures on him. One is from the U.S., which does not want to see the Minsk agreements implemented because it is still pursuing. When I say the US, I should make it very clear, I don't mean President Trump himself. I mean everyone else in the US government, the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, all of those people.
Pompeo.
Pompeo, absolutely Pompeo. All of those people want to see Ukraine continue along its conflict with Russia, because their objective is to bring ultimately Ukraine into NATO and to separate it from Russia as far as possible. And they want to see this conflict between Ukraine and Russia continue. And of course, there is another force within Ukraine which also resists any move towards peace. And that is, of course, the very hardline, ultra-right-wing elements in Ukraine, some of whom, in fact, most of whom, frankly, are ultra-fascists or neo-Nazis who've been parading and protesting against Zelensky's moves to broker any kind of peace agreement with Russia. Of course, the risk Zelensky runs by taking this ultra-hard line is that he betrays his own supporters in Ukraine. The people who voted for him in Ukraine in the expectation that he would deliver peace to Ukraine and restore the Ukrainian economy to some kind of functioning condition, which requires, to be very clear, a rapprochement with Russia. They will gradually, I think, come to feel that Zelensky has betrayed them, and you can very quickly see his popularity, which is already falling fast, that it will completely collapse. There was an opinion poll a few weeks ago which showed that fewer than 50% of Ukrainians still trust Zelensky. Back in the summer, it was almost 80%. So that gives you some idea of how fast his popularity is collapsing. But having said that, it's clear to me that he's more afraid of pressure from the United States, more afraid of pressure from the street, where these, as I said, ultra right-wing groups are very well organized, than he is about winning elections, which are not due to happen anyway for a couple of years.
What about Europe, specifically France and Germany? Macron was very, very specific. No country is getting into the EU. He was dead on specific, and he met Ukraine specifically. No country is getting into the EU in the foreseeable short term, midterm, or long term. So what about Europe?
I think Macron is going to be completely exasperated because he wants, and he's repeated this again in an extraordinary speech he's made at the Munich Security Conference. He wants to see a rapprochement with Russia, and he sees Ukraine and the attitudes that the Ukrainians are taking as a major obstacle to this. And I think, and I need to say this again, I am in Berlin at the moment, I think there are more and more people in Germany who are going to be increasingly exasperated by all of this. There was a meeting a few weeks ago in Moscow with the German business community coming along to Putin and saying how anxious they were for a resolution of the Ukrainian crisis so that, proper trade between Germany and Russia could resume. And now what they will see is that this isn't happening, and they will be extremely angry. And of course, the person who has stuck by Ukraine in Germany is Merkel, and Merkel is going to be leaving the scene, quitting the scene next year. Whether a future German government and a future German chancellor is going to be so committed to Ukraine remains to be seen, given that the CDU is under so much pressure now from the AfD, which is a party within Germany which strongly advocates for a rapprochement with Russia. So I think the Europeans will be absolutely fed up and exasperated. Macron will be furious. The Russians are clearly very angry. I mean, this telephone transcript that the Kremlin has released, as I said, it needs to be read to be believed. I've never read a transcript issued by the Kremlin that is so blunt. I mean, the language of the transcript is just extraordinary. It suggests an absolute furious row between Putin and Zelensky, with the Russian authorities making no attempt to conceal how angry the exchange became. So, I mean, the Russians are angry, the French are angry. I suspect the Germans before very long are going to be angry also. And of course, Zelensky's caught in the middle. He's caught between the Europeans and the Russians on the one hand, and he's caught between the Americans and the ultra hardliners, the neo-fascists, the neo-Nazis, the ultra-nationalists, all those people in Ukraine. He's caught between a hammer and an anvil, and he has no way out that I can see, because he lacks the strength and force of personality to pursue a strong game.
Okay, how's the Ukrainian economy, real quick?
Well, this is, of course, the thing, because, of course, you know, the Ukrainians, and this has been true for some years now, have been continue to churn out statistics about how well their economy is doing, like their population statistics, which, by the way, nobody any longer believes. They haven't had a proper census for years. Nobody, I think, actually believes their economic statistics either. Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the former Georgian president, who was for a time the governor of Odessa, Poroshenko, the previous Ukrainian president, made him the governor of Odessa. He recently did an interview in Ukraine, and you know, he's somebody who knows Ukraine very well, and he says Ukraine is in far worse condition than it was when it was part of the Soviet Union. The cities across Ukraine are deteriorating. Not so much Kiev, where all the money is now concentrated, but places outside, that everything is run down and breaking down. And he also spoke about various mayors of big cities, like the mayor of Odessa and the mayor of Kharkov, are now also busy setting up their private armies. And he spoke about the very real possibility of Ukraine breaking up into 5 different regions. In other words, the central government finally and completely collapsing. So that is something that Saakashvili said. Saakashvili is very anti-Russian. He is no sort of pro-Soviet person. On the contrary, he went out of his way to make it clear that he hated the Soviet Union and everything it stood for. So when he says that Ukraine today is worse off than it was then, when the Soviet Union was around, you get a sense of how bad in Ukraine things are. And I think his is a far more accurate picture than what you would get by looking at all of the statistics. I would add, or rather the statistics that the Ukrainians themselves are producing. My own personal view, and this is, again, I'm getting this from people who know the situation in Ukraine, that the economy, far from expanding, is actually contracting, just as the Russian economy in the 1990s, statistics were appearing that were suggesting that it was expanding. And we now know for a fact that it was really contracting.
Okay, and finally, Alexander, you mentioned that we may be moving away from the Minsk Agreement, and we may be going into a frozen conflict now in
well, I think we are
Ukraine. Okay, yeah. Officially, let's say officially,
yeah.
in a frozen conflict.
Yeah.
Zelensky pulls out of Minsk. He says, I'm done with it. So now we're officially in a frozen conflict.
If he pulls out of Minsk, then I think there will be a major crisis, because I think the Germans are committed to Minsk. I think, right. Bear in mind, Merkel linked the lifting of sanctions on Russia to full implementation of the Minsk Agreement. If the Ukrainians pull out of the Minsk Agreement, it's the Ukrainians who pull out of the Minsk Agreement, then what fig leaf does even Merkel have to keep the sanctions against Russia in place? I think if that happens, if we have a situation where Ukraine pulls out of the Minsk Agreement, then, as I said, all of Ukraine's so-called supporters in Europe are going to be left in a very difficult and awkward position indeed. And I wonder very much how they will respond to it. I think the United States will support Ukraine no matter what. I don't think Donald Trump personally has any commitment to Ukraine at all. I think people like Orban in Hungary have made it clear that they dislike Ukraine intensely. I think, as I said, the French are furious, and I think the Germans will be furious also. So, as I said, we're going to see a situation where the situation in Ukraine is no longer a bone of contention between the West and Russia. It becomes a bone of contention between Europe and the United States, which will be a strange and remarkable paradox.
Yeah, well, the U.S. couldn't give a crap about Europe. That's obvious,
Absolutely not.
especially the deep state. But
bear in mind, they can't win in Ukraine without Europe. That's something that I think the US may not fully appreciate. It's the Europeans who are paying the bill at the end of the day, and it's the Europeans who are saying, Ukraine one day, we support Ukraine. If Europe no longer supports Ukraine, very difficult to see how this thing in Ukraine can keep going, at least the way that it has been up to now. So it's all very well for the US to say, we don't give a crap about what the Europeans think, which, by the way, lots of Europeans.
They've said it. They've said it. Yeah, Victoria Nuland's on tape.
Absolutely. Victoria Nuland, F the EU and all that. But as I said, it's all very well them saying that. But as I said, in reality, without the Germans and the French on board, it seems to me that this project that they launched in Ukraine starts to become unsustainable. So it's not that straightforward for the US to simply turn around and say, well, we're going to plow on with Ukraine regardless. They may very well find that, what happens is that the Russians and the Germans, they showed in Minsk, they are perfectly capable of coming to agreements on Ukraine without consulting the United States, actually choose to do so. So let's say Germany, for example, decides to recognize Crimea's incorporation in Russia and decides to agree that, the eastern regions of Ukraine gives them some kind of recognition. What does the US then do?
My point is, okay, great. The U.S. doesn't care about Europe. The U.S. doesn't care about Ukraine either. The deep state doesn't care about Ukraine. Let's look at it from a different angle, though. Yeah. What if they don't care if Ukraine survives as a whole or disintegrates into 6, 7, 20 pieces?
Absolutely.
For them, we already know that the deep state, take the Bidens, for example, had their fingers in Ukraine, deeply entrenched in Ukraine. Hillary Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, deeply entrenched in Ukraine. What if they're using Ukraine now and they're using Zelensky in order to push for a conflict in the East, a real conflict, a hot war, so as to once again back Trump into some sort of corner? Once again, Trump, Ukraine, Trump, Putin, and back him into a corner. And they don't care whether Ukraine disintegrates, whether it survives. Yeah. What they care about are U.S. domestic political talking points. Once again, Alexander, and Adam Schiff's speech saying, oh my God, Trump, I can't believe you let Ukraine lose this war, or you're not supporting Ukraine in a conflict. They're the most important thing. If, we don't support Ukraine over there, Russia's going to come here, and all that nonsense again. That's my point. What if it's about the U.S. domestic politics?
If it is, which by the way, there's antecedents for that. The loss of China was being used in a big way in the 50s as part of U.S. political quarrels. Because let's be very clear: if Ukraine breaks up into 5 different places, there will be the Russians will basically end up dominating the lot. Maybe not Western Ukraine. And they will also run into a lot of opposition from some people in Kiev. Clearly, Kiev, by the way, I should say, is an anomaly. There is a very, very strong anti-Russian feelings in Kiev. They're not, and this I've heard from many people, representative of sentiments across the whole of Ukraine. But, if that happens, if the US is prepared to sacrifice Ukraine on the altar of its own domestic problems, well, that, of course, is entirely possible. I can very well easily see that happening.
They are.
I'm absolutely prepared to believe that there are some people who are crazy enough in the US and fanatical enough.
Pelosi, Nadler, Brennan, Clapper.
Absolutely, entirely able
Pompeo.
I have no difficulty believing any of that at all. What I'm going to say about it is 2 things. Firstly, it will be a massive blow to the prestige of the United States in Europe if that happens. But secondly, and this is a point always to bear in mind, I don't know that the American people ultimately care about Ukraine that much. There may be a vast fuss on the part of the American political elite about this. They may try to launch another attack on Trump over it. But, are American voters really concerned with what happens in Donbass? But, people who are blinded by anger and fanaticism. And I think some of the people in the US are, or who are desperate enough, because they feel that John Durham is snapping at their heels, people like that are capable of anything. One always has to say this, ultimately, when we do the kind of commentary that we do on the Duran, we assume, at least I assume, an element of rationality in Washington decision making. If that element of rationality is not there, if people are prepared to bring down the entire temple in order to kill, Trump, well, then it's impossible to talk in any reasonable way or analyze things in any reasonable way, because you're no longer talking about people who are showing any degree of rationality or reasonableness in the way they're behaving, even if you disagree with them. So, this is what I have to say. Ultimately, if the US is prepared to push it to that level, then it's bad for the US. It's probably not bad for Russia and Europe ultimately, because the problem is resolved. The US will be the loser. No one else.
Chaos, isn't it? It would be mass chaos in Europe. The US is thousands of miles away. It would be mass chaos in Europe.
I don't think it would be, because, as I said, I think if Ukraine were to break up in that kind of way, I think the Russians would move in and pick up the pieces. I think that would happen pretty fast. Actually.
Can they afford to do that?
I think they can afford to do it. I think that there are great misunderstandings about this. I think the economic synergies are there. There would be a certain amount of resistance in some places. In Kiev, there would be resistance, but pretty much in places like Odessa, for example, in Kharkov, in some of the central regions of Ukraine, I don't think there would be a problem. So I think you would see the economic synergies starting to move into place fairly quickly. There would be a period of 1, 2, 3 years when, as I said, the Russians would find that it was a stress for them. But as I said, they could do it. I've no doubt about it. But whether the US, if that were to happen, as I said, it would, oddly enough, stabilize the situation in Europe. It would be the US that would be frozen out. But the people of the US have shown an extraordinary capacity for doubling down on failure. They're doing it in all kinds of places. They've done it in Syria. They've done it in Venezuela. You name it. Where haven't they done it? So it's entirely possible they could do it again. But it would be irrational. And my own guess is that Donald Trump himself would be opposed to it. In fact, I'm sure he would. Though I also have to say, I think that there are some people who are fanatical enough in the United States not to care about that, and who would be willing to sacrifice US interests in order to score further points against Donald Trump. There are such people. I hope that they are not the majority in the policy-making bureaucracy. But I'm not going to say that for a fact.
That's the whole point of it, Alexander. To me, whenever I hear Ukraine coming up, it's been ground zero for Russiagate. It was ground zero, obviously, for Ukrainegate. And now you're hearing the tension start to rise up again. I always think to myself, for Pompeo's, for the deep state, for the Brennans and the Clappers and the Pelosi's and the Schiffs, it has nothing to do with Ukraine or Europe. It's all about how can we create chaos and somehow back Trump into a corner so we can get our ultimate goal, which is to impeach Trump.
Very clear about
Whether we blow up the world, for them, they don't care if the whole world blows up. They're fixated on getting Trump out.
The whole Ukrainian crisis, going all the way back to 2013 when it really begins, even going back further to 2004 with the Orange Revolution, has never been about Ukraine. It's been about Russia. It's been about trying to prevent Russia reintegrating economically, because there was never a political project to reintegrate it politically, but reintegrating economically the former Soviet economic space. Hillary Clinton said as much. She actually made a speech saying that the US would do everything it could to prevent this ever happening. And there's even a policy document that was written up during the Bush II presidency that said the same. That's what it's always been about. But if people are prepared to go even further, and they're prepared to use Ukraine to blow up Ukraine in order to blow up Donald Trump, then all I can say is I'm sure there are such people, but they
there are. There are.
We know there are. But if that is what has happened, then I think it is the final proof that the United States, or rather the government of the United States, has taken leave of its senses, because that is such a completely self-destructive approach. I mean, I just cannot see the logic of doing it. But then I'm a logical man, and these people are not. So maybe there's no point in discussing logic when talking to people like this.
The last 3 years, we have not seen logic.
Well, I mean, there's logic. I mean, what logic is there in Adam Schiff? I've never seen any sign of it.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there you go.
Exactly. There you go. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell. Smash that like button. Also go to SoundCloud and iTunes for an audio copy of this video. And please check us out on Telegram as well. Download the Telegram app and follow us there. And go to the Duran shop and pick up some merchandise, magic mugs, and awesome polo shirts with the embroidered gold eagle.
Indeed, I like of the sort that I am wearing at the moment, and you can see the gold eagle there, Duran golden eagle on this beautiful black 100% cotton, magnificent, incredibly stylish polo shirt. And I'm wearing it, of course, in Berlin. We were talking about Germany now. So, this is a very stylish city in so many ways. You want to be well dressed when you're here, and going out in Berlin, which is a place where you can find all sorts of amazing places to go out to. Really, stylish and glamorous places. And if you want to do something like that, buy yourself, all I can say is, a Duran polo shirt, because you will fit in perfectly into this world. But of course, we don't just have beautiful and amazing Duran polo shirts in our shop. We also have the magic mugs that Alex was referring to. I'm afraid I haven't brought any with me to Berlin, because frankly, as I'm going around with a suitcase, I don't want to risk losing it. I'm very prone to losing things. But we have amazing magic mugs of superb quality. We also have amazing shirts, not just polo shirts, but t-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved, also 100% cotton, v-neck shirts too, and amazing other things. We've got hats and stickers and hoodies, all of the same superb quality. And you can also find our ebooks on our shop, where we discuss all these various topics, some of these topics that we've been talking about here in our programs. So you support us by going to our shop, because really that's how we depend, how we are able to survive. We depend on our viewers supporting us, and we depend partly on you coming to our shop and buying these things. But we've made sure that what you buy in our shop is of outstanding quality. You will enjoy owning it. So don't hold back. Support the Duran. Support yourself by owning these great things. Come to our shop, and Alex will tell you how to do it.
TheDuranShop.com. You'll find the link in the description box down below. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.